is Ava Geierstanger, and I'm the leader of the youth-led plastic awareness campaign, Plastic Free Gen Z. I'm here with my friend Amber today.
Hi, my name is Amber Chen. I'm the founder of the environmental justice educational campaign Anti-Racist Planet.
And welcome everyone to the Plastic Pollution Coalition Youth Ambassador Countdown to COP26.
Plastic Pollution Coalition is a growing global of more than 1,200 organizations, businesses, and thought leaders in 75 countries working towards a just, equitable world free of plastic pollution and its toxic impacts on humans, animals, waterways, the ocean, and the environment.
Today we have the great privilege of interviewing Heather White. Heather tackles climate crisis anxiety by encouraging daily individual actions. Her nonprofit, One Green Thing, began earlier this year and provides Generation Z activists and beyond with resources to turn eco-anxiety into positive action. Heather is the former executive director of Yellowstone Forever and the Environmental Working Group. She is an attorney and sits on the executive advisory board of the Plastic Pollution Coalition and has been named, quote, one of the top 100 women in wellness by Mind Body Green, as well as the recipient of the Women in Sustainability Leadership Award.
Thank you so much for being here, Heather. Let's get started.
So our first question today is how your past work and experience has brought you to creating One Green Thing.
Oh, that's a wonderful question, Ava and Amber. Thank you. I am based in Bozeman, Montana. And first and foremost, even though I'm an environmental lawyer, first and foremost, I'm a mom. So I'm a mom of two Gen Zers. I have a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old. And that's what really brought me to be the creator of One Green Thing. I have always been focused on science and the environment, really interested in climate issues ever since I was young. I studied environmental science in college. I went to law school. I worked on Capitol Hill. I worked in environmental health organizations and then working to save public lands. But it really was my kids who brought me to this intersection between mental health and climate. And it started in 2019 when my daughter was very interested, my older daughter, in going to the climate strike, the Greta Thunberg inspired climate strike that actually came here to Bozeman. And she asked for our permission to walk out, which of course, we granted to her. And as we were talking at the dinner table, I just pointed out that a big thunderstorm was supposed to happen during the rally. So I told her, I'm happy to drive you if you need me to drive you someplace, because she has like a big backpack and a trumpet. And you know how it is, like being a high school student, you have like a lot of stuff that you're carrying. And this was before the pandemic. And that offer did not go over very well. Because she was like, first of all, it's a strike, Mom. Like the whole point is to walk out. Like I'm going to carry a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm walking out. And secondly, it's not very far. And third, what are you doing driving me? Like offering to drive me. And she got upset. She was just saying, when is your generation going to get it? I love that. This is my daughter talking now. I love that you say Gen Z is so inspiring and you love all the activism and the energy that they have. But Mom, it can't be on our shoulders. Like we need your help. And I think what was so interesting for me is that literally my whole career had been in environmental science, environmental policy and activism. I wouldn't really necessarily call myself an activist. I think actually I've been to more protests in the last 2 years than I have my entire life. A lot of my work was more policy and legal and law and working with Congress as opposed to like direct action. But it was really my kids who were saying, we need you and we need you to be active in a whole nother realm. And then we started talking about anxiety about the future and how climate change really makes that impact. And so that's what inspired me to write a book that's coming out next spring, next April 2022, and also to start the organization One Green Thing.
That's incredible. Also, that's quite the resume. So your nonprofit, One Green Thing, promotes intergenerational collaboration surrounding teen mental health. So what does that look like in the context of eco-anxiety?
Amber, that's a great question. And that's one of these things we're trying to figure out. What we know is that we need Gen Z to be heard. Gen Z is already really respected, but they need to be heard. And we also need to create opportunities for Gen Z to have hope. Because I feel like a lot of kids in your generation do feel what my daughter was saying, is that all of this is going to rest on their shoulders when in fact, we don't have enough time. One of the things my daughter keeps saying, Mom, in 10 years, when the United Nations says, we're already in a code red, and in 10 years, there's no looking back when it comes to the impacts of climate change, I'm going to be 26. Mom, even if I'm, a lawyer or an engineer or an amazing scientist or an amazing, solar panel expert, that's not enough time for me personally as a teenager now to be able to make those differences. So we need to make sure that baby boomers and Gen X and millennials are really listening to Gen Z and their feelings and their concerns and their fears. But we also need to provide hope by pointing to big obstacles that we've been able to overcome culturally at a grassroots level. We have so much to do when it comes to equity and justice. And Amber, I love that you're working on environmental justice. I think it's so important, but we have come a long way. One of the stories that I think maybe Gen Z isn't as aware of is the nuclear freeze movement. When I was growing up, I remember in the 4th and 5th and 6th grade being really worried about nuclear war. I mean, it was something like we watched the news all the time because we were really concerned about it. And we were able to have a huge movement across the country that was very diverse, really calling on the United States and Russia to end the Cold War. And there were a lot of other factors that were economic and, geopolitical, just like there is in climate. But we do have powerful, positive examples where people have made a huge difference and literally prevented the end of the world. So we can do it. And I think that's on the older generations to create those opportunities where you can hear about those examples. So a lot of it is, I'm thinking, and I'd love to hear what you all think, Ava and Amber, about like, what does intergenerational partnership mean? But I'm thinking it's conversations within families. It's discussions like that can really make the difference intergenerationally. And even having discussion guides, community conversations, but just having these platforms where you're not only heard, but where other generations also share and can really listen, but also provide hope.
I think that's a really great point. There's a lot of different experiences that have had positive outcomes. And if we look at the climate crisis, is so overwhelming, and it should really not be put all on, the young people's shoulders. So, and there's a lot of adults. I mean, a lot of adults are really passionate about this too. And so it's just a matter of figuring out how we can all work together on this, right?
Right. And I think that's one of the things I talk about in my book. And one of the principles of the nonprofit is think beyond your age. And that's the idea of intergenerational partnership. So not only for people like me, what type of ancestor do I want to be is one of the questions, but also for Gen Z, what type of ancestor do you want to be? 50 years from now, when you're having an intergenerational conversation with someone in your family or another young person, what are they going to thank you for? What are they going to wish that you had known? I think that type of exercise and that type of reflection can really help us break through the overwhelm and the anxiety and move towards action.
One Green Thing has numerous resources for taking positive individual actions towards a healthier and safer future. So how can individual actions complement larger policy change?
Okay, that's a really important question. Thank you so much, Ava. I think everyone knows, that individually we cannot solve the climate crisis, right? Heather White, no matter how, like if I am vegan for the rest of my life and never get into another car, I will not solve the climate crisis. But individual actions absolutely matter. So don't buy into it's so big we can't do anything, which I think a lot of people feel that. And I understandably, they feel that. The way individual action matters is that it changes the culture. If you can create a daily practice of sustainability, which is what we're trying to promote at One Green Thing, just one green thing that you do a day. And it doesn't have to be calling your member of Congress every day, although I would encourage you to do that regularly. It can be as simple as going for a walk. It can be recycling. It can be calling your utility and asking about their renewable portfolio standard. It can be reading an article and sharing it with your friends. Those individual actions do add up because they drive culture change. And I think that's something that we need to constantly be reminding people, because of course we need huge policy solutions and market solutions, but we only get there if the political will changes. And the only way that changes is through those individual actions. The other thing that we offer at One Green Thing, which is kind of neat, is that I think a lot of people, especially with what we've experienced in the last 2 years, in the United States, weather-wise, it's just been really dramatic, whether it be the wildfires that turned the skies of San Francisco orange, the wildfires that we're experiencing here in Montana, the flooding that we saw in New York, Hurricane Ida in Louisiana, the flooding in Tennessee. I mean, you basically name an area of the country and there's been substantial extreme weather on top of systemic racism, on top of, huge issues with economic disparity, on top of a global pandemic. I mean, it's a lot, right? So people are interested in getting involved, but they're not really sure how to get involved. So what we have is a service superpower assessment. It's kind of like a Myers-Briggs or a Strength Finder or an Enneagram about service. How do you show up in service? What is your personality through service? And then we provide you ideas based on who you are and what your strengths are on how you can get involved and what your one green things might look like.
Ava and I actually took the quiz. And so I'm an adventurer and Ava is a wonk.
Oh, great. That's wonderful. Well, and the idea is as an adventurer, you can start identifying of like, obviously you love travel, but also hands-on environmental education. You're really comfortable helping people go out of their comfort zones. So there's a lot of organizations that may really connect with you, like National Wildlife Federation is a great example. They have all of these wonderful environmental education tools. So that might be like a national nonprofit that you'd be interested in. You've already talked about how important it is for you for environmental justice, but there's also all kinds of wonderful programs like Latino Outdoors, there's Outdoor Afro, there's all kinds of neat organizations that are really trying to get more people of color out in the outdoors and feeling comfortable and safe, and also educating allies on how can you talk about that? How can you create these opportunities? So the adventure, those might be some one green things that you'd be interested in. And as a wonk, there's all kinds of great policy groups out there. You're already working with Plastic Pollution Coalition in the Break Free from Plastic Act, but there's also wonderful organizations at the national level, like Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, but then there's also the CalPIRGs and all kinds of other groups that you may want to connect with. So the idea is that like that service superpower identity is just an entry point, a jumping off point, for you to think about what you might want to do and what might connect with you and how you want to engage with the movement. But you're already doing so much. My goodness, you both founded organizations. So it's funny for me to say, oh, and you can use this.
No.
But I think it's helpful for other folks to figure out like, well, what do I do? How do I help?
Yeah.
So in your words, Heather, how has the pandemic influenced eco-anxiety and discussion about mental health?
Wow, that is another excellent question. I think that the pandemic has made mental health front and center for everyone. Just the isolation that we've been under, all of us, no matter your generation. I will say before the pandemic, there is a study called the Loneliness Index that Cigna puts out, and Gen Z was considered the loneliest generation. In the most recent survey, this was 2019, 5 out of 10 baby boomers say they feel lonely or disconnected versus 8 out of 10 Gen Zers. So we have a situation where Gen Z is literally lonelier than the elderly, which my mom, who is a baby boomer, really takes issue with the fact that I call her elderly, but like technically it's true. So that was before the pandemic happened. And then we had the move to online school. Then we had the disconnection from not only peer groups, but also families, which are very important in community. So I think that the pandemic has put mental health front and center. I think eco-anxiety, because of what we've experienced across the country and of course across the world, just the huge, huge impacts of climate change, has meant that eco-anxiety has expanded that term. It used to be like the American Psychological Association calls it the chronic fear of environmental doom. But now I think that definition has expanded to generalized anxiety about the state of the world and about the future. And I think that more and more we're going to see people talking about eco-anxiety in that larger context. Just in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw a real reckoning. We've also seen a big, intense backlash to that. And we've seen it at a very hyper local level in school boards with like critical race theory, anti-critical race theory, and all kinds of like intense political discussions and rancor. And it's really important that as a community that we continue to fight to put equity front and center So I just feel like all these issues, equity, mental health, income disparity, how we respect the environment, how do we take care of each other, and intergenerational partnerships. It feels to me, and I'd love to hear what you all think, that it's all kind of melding and coming together into in a way that we need to talk about it in a very comprehensive way. Does that sound right to you all? Like, what's your experiences?
I mean, I feel like personally, I can get overwhelmed by everything going on, especially during the pandemic. It was like a lot of different things happening all at once, and then meanwhile, there's so many things going on that the media is not really focusing on climate change. So it's like, I know that it's happening and I know it's a big issue, but no one's talking about it as much. Of course, bigger issues, if we're dealing with a global pandemic, like, of course, there's immediate things, but it's like climate change is so, so important. It needs to be really the front for a lot of times. And yeah, I'd love to hear what Amber thinks as well.
I also noticed that, during the pandemic, the media sort of made this big thing about how since people weren't really commuting to work anymore, there was less smog. So there was a lot of focus on that. But that sort of countered a lot of efforts, especially within plastic pollution of, people had been like trying to push through plastics legislation. I know there was some legislation in California that was going to be pushed through, before the pandemic happened. And then when the pandemic happened, we saw this rise in single-use plastics. Grocery stores began not accepting reusable bags anymore. And so I think that sort of like created this interesting effect in terms of eco anxiety, but then also like pandemic anxiety and how the two sort of like clash with each other.
I think that's such a good point, right? I mean, I know like takeout through the roof. I've seen all of the images of the plastic of takeout. And at the same time, we had restaurants really hurting and restaurant workers hurting because so few people could go. It wasn't safe to be in restaurants this time last year. So it's all, I think one of the things that's a takeaway is that we are actually, all of us, interconnected, right? As someone who studies environmental science and biology, like we know that, right? But that's not something that people really think about at a big scale. And I think the pandemic has shifted that. But you're right, kind of, I think some people felt like they had to hit the brakes on some aspects of their advocacy because of the pandemic, but at the same time, it's all connected. And then we see an increase of plastic production because we know renewables are on the increase and fossil fuels are on the no longer as economically viable for the company. So it's very complex and it's hard to navigate. And so that's why I keep trying to bring people back to do one thing that you can do each day. And it can be on different scales. It can be, going to a climate strike. It can be writing a letter to a member of Congress, but it also can be, spending time outdoors with someone you love. It can, or making a better choice at the store about something that is buying organic fruit instead of a conventional fruit. I mean it's all these small little actions is where I think people can maintain some sense of being grounded in all of the overwhelm.
Our next question is about your former role as the president of Yellowstone Forever, which for our viewers who do not know is the nonprofit partner to Yellowstone National Park. And so we'd like to ask what role you think national parks play in the climate movement and in solving plastic pollution. This is kind of an aspect not a lot of people think about, but how do national parks play a role in all of this?
Oh, another great question. And PPC actually sponsored a webinar about the movement for plastic-free outdoors and how there are initiatives right now. And there's a big push to try to get the Biden administration to ban single-use plastic in the national parks. So on the plastic front, I think that if there is this initiative that we did see under the Obama administration was focused on plastic water bottles. Obviously, a lot of folks are carrying water with them through the park as they're camping, but they in several key parks in the Obama administration had refillable water stations to try to reduce that impact of plastics in the park. So I think there's a great opportunity for the parks to adopt this principle of trying to reduce single-use plastic in the parks, because the national parks are such a tremendous learning laboratory for Americans. I mean, they are all of our parks. So many people come to Yellowstone. I think the most visited park is actually Great Smokies, National Park, which is where I grew up. I'm from East Tennessee originally, but Yellowstone, I think, is in the top 10. I mean, there's so many people, and we've even seen more visitation this year than 2 years ago, pre-pandemic. So because so many people are visiting these beautiful areas, I think there's a great opportunity for education. Also, I would say there's another initiative, 30 by 30, which is try to preserve by 2030. I don't remember how many, 30% of the world's, I think it's 30% of the world's land. And national parks are important in that conservation aspect, to actually keep the carbon in the soil. There's no agriculture that's happening there, although regenerative ag is a huge climate solution. But these are tremendous solutions for our climate crisis because we have that land and preservation. I would also say, especially because we're talking about equity and social justice, the park system has done a lot and needs to do more about telling the story about how the parks were created. Yellowstone was created in 1872, so it was the world's first national park, but 26 different tribes considered the area of the park as common hunting ground, and it was very important to those tribes. So telling the story of how the park was created, about the tribal connections, there's some great opportunities for us to really recognize like our concept of wilderness, our meaning, American frontierism's concept of wilderness, and how the lands were managed by indigenous people who were already living there. So I think there's a great role that national parks can play in reducing plastic pollution and educating people about the importance of it, and actually being a climate solution themselves, and also really telling the full story about how they were created, and making sure that we're constantly thinking about equity and social justice in these solutions.
That brings us to our last question, which is sort of a combination of two questions, but they're pretty big. How can policy and legislation help solve the plastic pollution crisis? And what are some feasible commitments that you'd like to see come out of COP26?
Oh, wow. That's another fantastic question. I want to hear from both of you about this too. The Break Free from Plastic Act has been reintroduced this Congress. It's a really important bill in that it looks at kind of cradle to grave, meaning that if you produce plastic, you're responsible for recycling it. There's some great resources that Plastic Pollution Coalition has about the recycling scam, which is that it's on us consumers to figure out how to reduce litter and how to deal with products that never break down, as opposed to the people who manufacture it. So I think that's a really important principle that's in the Break Free from Plastic Act, is to make sure that people who manufacture the products are responsible for the safe disposal and recycling of it. That's first and foremost. I would also say it's important that they want to help communities with composting on a large scale, and help communities also understand what microplastics are doing to their environment. So the educational component is really key too. And I think with the upcoming COP26 that's happening, I think, we have a lot of these international commitments. I think there needs to be a big focus on action, and the report card of what we're doing, because we're at a point now where conversation and discussion can only take you so far, and we need to see the action plan behind the commitments that are being made. When it comes to plastic, I would say more and more people are understanding the connection between climate and plastic change. The film, The Story of Plastic, does a great job on that, helping us understand that the oil companies are doubling down on plastic production because they know that energy is going in a different direction, and that's renewables. And they're also marketing intensely single-use packets to lesser developed countries. So I think that's a really important conversation that we need to have too, about we have to keep our eye on the ball when it comes to, even if we get the Break Free from Plastic Act passed here, even if we see some big commitments coming out of COP26, we need to make sure that we're looking at internationally the players, and we're seeing huge action happen. What about you? What do you all think? What are your hopes?
Ava, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I know we have 10 requests for COP26, and among them are a lot of the things that you've just mentioned. Ensuring that we have an environmental justice lens when approaching this issue, and then also combining, plastic pollution and climate change, and understanding the connection between the two. And this goes in a couple different ways. Number one, we have air pollution, we have water, pollution that's impacting our water sources. That comes from microplastics, but it also comes from leakages from like oil drilling and fracking. And so we have a lot of, we have our 10 requests for COP26, but most importantly, it's that we just continue to have a space to discuss this and actually come up with concrete solutions that will actually work. Amber, do you have anything?
Yeah, so I'm really concerned about just environmental justice in general, but I think, out of all of our 10 requests that Plastic Pollution Coalition's Youth Ambassadors have put together, what's important to me is that we really have to like make sure that this movement is something intersectional and inclusive because, the environmental movement has just for years been so white dominated. It was rooted in the really discriminatory practices of urban white elites that Heather, you sort of referenced when you talked about the founding of Yellowstone National Park. Just the fact that that founding was to sort of be totally to the detriment of indigenous tribes that were in that place. So, yeah, I really think that when we commit to policy in big international settings, it's really important for these people in positions of power to really uplift people that are being affected by climate crisis the most. In terms of these like big country gatherings, I think that means uplifting smaller countries that are the countries that have majority people of color populations that are experiencing the worst effects of climate change due to the pollution of countries like the United States that produce way more pollution than these smaller countries.
Heather, thank you so much for talking with us today and sharing your work and your perspective. We're really honored to have gotten this opportunity to speak with you about COP26 and plastic pollution and eco-anxiety, and it's just a true honor to get to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ava and Amber, thank you so much for your time and for your commitment. I think what I want to say in conclusion is, as inspired as I am that the two of you have already created your own nonprofits and you're so focused on environmental activism and policy and social justice, I want to make sure that this is not all on your shoulders. There are people who are Gen Xers like me and baby boomers and millennials. We really want to work with you to create a healthier, greener future that's more equitable for all. And we're committed to doing that. So you are not alone. And just know that we're here for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.